My name's Richard Witten, and my formal title is Special Advisor to the President of Columbia University, although I have a background on Wall Street, and thankfully we're not talking about ethics in Wall Street today, or at least not while I'm in the room. So my primary responsibility is to introduce Donnel Baird, but I have a couple of preparatory comments before we bring on Donnel. The first is that it was interesting that Bruce showed the slide to the effect that startups and newly founded businesses rate high on the trust level. And that's sort of an interesting observation, and perhaps I'll explore why that might be. The first point I'd make is that Edmund Phelps, who's a professor here at Columbia, a Nobel Prize laureate, wrote an extraordinarily interesting book called Mass Flourishing. And the point of the book, distilling 600 pages of economic language into a sentence or two, is that societies and people are their happiest when they are allowed and encouraged to be creative and to solve problems. And Ned's prescription is that governments around the world, particularly the US, should enact legislation to get out of entrepreneurs' ways or to encourage entrepreneurship. Whether you think that is or is not the case, it doesn't really matter, because this notion of solving problems at a grassroots level is becoming an extraordinarily important economic and social force in this country and around the world. So that's consistent with Ned's observation that societies feel good and are most productive when they're encouraged to think about solving problems, and the observation which Bruce made is that we trust that. We feel good about it, and we actually trust these entrepreneurs as they seek to create solutions in light of the fact that governments and big companies have trouble creating those solutions. The second point I'd make, to David's point about, okay, where's the university here? So the university's function, among others, is as an entrepreneur. I mean, we're allowed to sit here with billions of dollars of endowment tax-free. We're allowed to sit here with billions of dollars of real estate investments tax-free. Why? Why do we get that kind of special treatment? Well, one thing we do, obviously, is we educate people. But the other thing we do, which is perhaps even more important, is that we train people and we use our resources to solve problems. Whether it's climate change problems or democratization, freedom of expression problems, or HIV/AIDS problems, that's what research universities have as an important mandate. And a subset of that mandate is teaching people, providing the toolkits for our students and our faculty to be able to actually go out and make a difference in the world. Traditionally, academic institutions and academicians write a paper. Job is done, gets published in Lancet, gets published in the Harvard Business Review, and then it's up to somebody else to implement those. The new university approach is to give these authors and our researchers the skills to be able to take these ideas and actually do things with them, make them happen, and that's in the form 99% of the time of a startup, whether it's a startup for-profit company or a startup not social enterprise or not-for-profit company. So there is, I think there's an obvious correlation between the trust that we think that these startups are due and that we express, the university's role in fostering this kind of a mentality and in fostering this kind of a profile by our students, and the last fact I'll make before introducing Donnel is that we actually produce unbelievably successful, innovative, creative folks who do unbelievably creative, wonderful things for society. And one of them is Blocpower. So let me just read Donnel's bio, and then we'll turn it over to him, because he's got a really interesting presentation for us. So Donnel Baird is the founder of Blocpower, an early stage clean tech startup based here in the city. Blocpower develops portfolios of clean energy retrofit opportunities in underserved communities and connects those opportunities to investors seeking social, environmental, and financial returns. Blocpower creates jobs for qualified low-income workers, energy savings for community institutions, reduces carbon emissions, and provides returns to investors. Donnel is a graduate of Duke University and, more importantly, Columbia Business School, where he was a recipient of the Board of Overseers Fellowship and a recipient of investment from the Lang Fund for Entrepreneurial Initiatives. He spent 4 years as a political and community organizer, and we know where that leads, and more than 2 years managing a national initiative to leverage American reinvestment and to leverage the American Reinvestment and Recovery Act energy efficiency investments in underserved communities. Donnel has been extraordinarily helpful to my organization here at Columbia, Columbia Entrepreneurship, in serving as a mentor to younger folks that are coming up behind him with similar approaches and similar attitudes. So let me turn this over to Donnel, and then I'll come back to moderate questions if there are any.
Hi, everyone. I'm Donnel. I'll try to keep the conversation, the overview of our business model short, and to leave more time for Richard and I to kind of explore the ethical implications of it, if that makes sense. But as Richard mentioned, I started as a community organizer. I grew up, my parents were immigrants. We grew up in a one-bedroom apartment in central Brooklyn. We were really poor, and our building did not have heat, and so we would kind of turn on the oven to heat our one-bedroom apartment and crack the window to let the fumes escape. But as I became older and after I graduated from Duke, I wanted to, quote unquote, give something back to the other kids in the neighborhood who I grew up with, who didn't go to prep school, who didn't go to Duke. So I became a community organizer in New York City's poorest neighborhood, which is Brownsville, Brooklyn. That's where Mike Tyson grew up. And I worked there for 3 years. It was awful. Really high unemployment rates, really high rates of HIV. The incarceration rates are enormous, and so the state government spends $1 million per block on 17 blocks annually in Brownsville to incarcerate just residents of that block. So it's a really terrible neighborhood, and most days it was a struggle to kind of make it out of my office and kind of walk into the projects and talk to people. Just emotionally and psychologically, it was really difficult to manage. But one of the things that I noticed one day, about 3 years in, was that in the dead of winter, the windows in all the huge 18-story public housing complexes, even though it was freezing outside, there's snow on the ground, the windows were open. And I said, aha, like this building is having the same kind of heating inefficiencies that I grew up with in my parents' one-bedroom apartment. And wouldn't it be great if we could hire young people who live in these public housing buildings to green the building, which would save a lot of taxpayer dollars, it'd be great for public health, create a lot of jobs, solve a lot of the problems that we're facing in the neighborhood. So that's the background of where Blocpower comes from. And where we landed on it is that we're a technology platform focused on connecting institutional and retail investors to inefficient buildings, which we think are really important because they cause bankruptcies for the building owners and residents. They cause really high rates of asthma. They cause blackouts for the utility company. And they're a leading driver of climate change. And lots of folks, if you believe in climate change and don't think that it's a hoax invented by the Chinese, lots of folks understand that buildings in America are a primary driver of American carbon emissions. And we'd have a larger climate impact if we retrofitted buildings across the country, even more so than if everyone bought a Tesla and had an electric vehicle, right? So buildings are important to fix and to green. It's a huge market. It's a $500 billion market domestically. But folks haven't really been able to address it at scale. And the reason for that is because inefficient buildings are really, really hard to solve. The kind of, and I learned here at Columbia that the approaches that the current industry, the engineering industry, the financial services industry, the construction industry, the approaches that these industries take to greening inefficient buildings are fragmented. And any good MBA graduate of Columbia Business School knows that in a fragmented industry, you want to consolidate, you want to lower costs by streamlining, you want to try to integrate. I was not a good student. I failed the course. But I did learn that fragmented industries were rife with opportunity. And so where we see the fragmentation is in customer education. The building owners themselves have a lot to learn about how to green their buildings. The mechanical engineers that survey the buildings are inefficient. They charge high rates on an hourly basis, kind of consulting. Financial services is not willing to invest in these neighborhoods. Most of the neighborhoods that we focus on domestically were involved in the subprime mortgage crisis, and so are difficult to finance. And then the construction and installation process of the green energy technologies, whether it's solar panels or high efficiency smart pumps or heating systems from the Netherlands or Japan that we specify for our churches and synagogues and hospitals that we serve. The installation process is quite expensive and lacks transparency. So we want to bring a range of efficiencies to these various industries that make greening American buildings complicated. And the trend that allows us to do that is a set of tech trends coming out of Silicon Valley. One is the Internet of Things. The second is cloud computing. And the third is mobile, the fact that everyone has a smartphone. And what that means is that all of our buildings, even when they're inefficient, produce a ton of data. And that data allows us to do the kinds of analysis, whether it's engineering analysis or financial analysis or construction analysis, that can lower costs across our value chain. So we're building an online platform that connects buildings to institutional investors. And I will skip forward here. I think it's important to note in this context that we're a public benefits corporation. Our investors understand that we are operating in order to reduce carbon emissions, create jobs and economic development, as well as to create financial returns. And so as a manager, I have a fiduciary obligation to provide financial returns, but can't be sued or held accountable if, for instance, I decide to install solar hot water systems in a public housing complex instead of a natural gas facility. While the natural gas may provide higher financial returns to my investors, right? I can account for the carbon impact that we would like to have. So all of our corporate investors kind of understand and have signed on to that, which I think is interesting. So despite that kind of wavy gravy liberal public benefits corporation, we still have been fortunate to have market traction. We have a 200% growth rate year over year since I barely graduated out of Columbia Business School, and we've had the good fortune to be backed by market rate venture capitalists, Andreessen Horowitz, early investors in Facebook and Twitter and Airbnb, K-Poor Capital, Mitch K-Poor helped popularize a spreadsheet with Lotus. Columbia Business School invested in us as well. And we are delighted to see that there's an appetite for public benefit. A core part of our platform, I'm just gonna close here, is the increasing trend, particularly among millennials, towards seeking social and environmental returns along with their financial returns. And so when you talk to the best wealth managers at all the banks, they say that their high net worth clients want to see 3 to 5% of their assets invested in some kind of social or environmental impact fund, right? And so that's a ton of capital. McKinsey and Deloitte project $50 billion that's looking for a social and environmental impact as well as financial impact. And so we are looking to connect that capital with the buildings that our big data kind of indicates makes sense. Last, we encourage all the construction companies that install our projects to hire from a pool of hard-to-employ population. So ex-offenders, folks who grew up in public housing, folks who grew up in foster care. We look to have those people trained. The very best graduates of those training programs are hired by our contractors to install our projects. And so we think that by kind of taking responsibility across our entire value chain, that we create a lot of value for our investors, for our employees, for our customers, and actually end up lowering our customer acquisition cost up front, right? Because it's easier and cheaper for us to recruit new clients because we have a brand and we have a set of operations that communicates to our customers that we really care about them and we care about what's happening in their community. So that's our thesis. I'll take a minute to outline a few projects that we have going on in New York, and then I'll look forward to joining Richard. So we have a couple enterprise projects. The first is with the New York City mayor. We're retrofitting between 500 and 2,000 buildings in Brooklyn, which is about $100 to $150 million project finance opportunity for our project investors. We're greening a large number of affordable housing buildings in Brooklyn. So as we lower the energy consumption, we're reducing carbon emissions, we're providing financial returns, but we're also preserving the ability of those affordable housing buildings to kind of operate and save money and to stay affordable as rents rise. We have a project with the Department of Energy and the Obama administration to provide capital at scale to smaller buildings that engineering services firm and financial services firms cannot reach. And so buildings smaller than 50,000 square feet, bodegas, restaurants, churches, synagogues, mosques. We focus on providing our services to these buildings. We're building a community-owned microgrid back to Brownsville, where I was a community organizer, where Mike Tyson grew up. It's a $60 million project. We're installing solar panels on all the roofs. The sale of the electricity that the solar panels generates will provide a set of revenue, which will be jointly distributed 49% to Con Edison, our New York City utility, and 51% to the residents of the poorest census tract in New York City. And so we project that there's going to be about $900,000 of income that we're going to be able to distribute as dividends to the residents of the housing complexes where I was a community organizer. And last, we're doing, I don't know if I'm supposed to talk about this deal publicly, but we are working with an investment bank to green 100 buildings in the Bronx that have really, really high asthma rates. We've taken data from the local hospital system that pinpoints which buildings in the Bronx have higher than usual cases of chronic childhood asthma. And we go in, we green those buildings, we measure the reduction in particulate matter in the air of those buildings, the indoor pollution. MIT kind of verifies it, and we are able to correlate the corresponding reduction in emergency room visits from kids with high rates of chronic asthma to the local emergency room, and so the local hospital is incentivized to invest $250,000 up front in order to avoid having more kids come into the hospital room with asthma attacks. So those are the kinds of projects that we think are kind of structure and focus on a set of ethical, you can say ethical, returns to investors allows us to do. Thanks very much.
Got a mic? So who here believes he had trouble graduating from Columbia Business School, right?
Failed a class.
Yeah,
Had to take a makeup class,
Yeah.
but it was one of the best classes that I took. It was Steve Blank's Lean Startup class.
Launchpad.
Yeah. So it was great.
Yeah, well, Steve would be proud of you. Steve is proud of you, I happen to know that. So I'll start this off with a somewhat rhetorical question, and then I encourage those of you who have questions to ask them. So here's the rhetorical question. Shouldn't Con Ed be doing this? And why not?
Con Edison is a publicly traded corporation. It's highly regulated. Right now, the electricity grid in Brooklyn is aged out. It needs to be replaced, and it costs $1.2 billion to replace it. Con Edison would love to raise, $1.5 billion, increase all of our electricity rates across New York City, put in the new infrastructure, and Mr. Rogers can correct me on all this if I'm misstating anything about the utility industry's incentives. But that's how they make their profit and make their returns to their financial investors. In this instance, the Governor Cuomo, to his great credit, has said, we want New York State to be a leader in energy efficiency, in renewables. I want Con Ed to really find ways to make investments in renewable energy, even in dense urban environments.
So I guess the point I was trying to make is that only at this kind of a granular, smaller level can you get into the weeds the way Donnel has done. And so that goes to the expectations of what large organizations are capable of doing. Large governments, large corporations, large public utilities. I think you mentioned this too about rates of return. They're governed by a different set of perhaps conditions than a startup that can be much more flexible in terms of how it's organized and what it tells its investors its objectives are.
And to the point that you highlighted about Bruce's presentation, utilities are hated by their customers across the board. And so we as a startup have an opportunity to come in and say, no, we want to do something great for you. It's very difficult for the utility company to do that.
Right. I'll ask one more question, and that is, in Steve's Lean Launchpad program, which you say you failed, but I still am dubious about that. You're encouraged to get, he calls it getting out of the office. Go out and actually talk to people who you think you are solving problems for. And so you start with an idea, and that idea lives in your head. And Steve requires that you go out and test that proposition with your constituents, which Blocpower seems to have done extremely well. You listen, right? The things that you do are a function of the information that you receive from your constituents. Want to talk a little bit about that and how you went out and canvassed these communities and listened to them, and that's how it formed your strategies here?
Absolutely. I'd actually failed an earlier course. I was trying to put together a pilot in Harlem where I was learning from barbershops and local restaurants about what kind of technologies or problems they were having with green energy. And the business school, loaned me $5,000 to go out and kind of work with them. And I got so busy running this pilot that I forgot to do my coursework and failed a class, and therefore had to take Steve Blank's class in order to graduate and receive my diploma, which was fantastic because in that course, Steve really does teach you to focus like a laser on learning from your customers. And his famous quote is, get out of the building. I was fortunate to have a network of people who I'd built relationships as a community organizer and was able to interview hundreds of them. And so my last year of business school was spent doing, literally about 225 interviews with potential future customers about the range of problems they were experiencing in operating their building, whether or not addressing their carbon footprint was something that mattered to them, and if so, how. We also, on the other side of our market, interviewed about 150 financial institutions, everyone from the big banks to private equity firms to VCs, to find out if they had an appetite on their side in providing capital to these kinds of projects. And so that's about 400 interviews. That's why I was too busy for class, because we wanted to have that data. Frankly, I wanted to have that data to show it to my wife to see if I could get permission to start the company. She's a lawyer. She's pretty intense. But we needed that data to make sure that the kind of transactions that we hope would occur on our financial marketplace, it made sense to all participants.
Yes, sir.
So Donnel, I wanted to ask you about how the organization is funded to date. You've indicated you have a very big pipeline. How you're thinking about funding going forward. Is that something where the money is now coming to you, or are there still issues around how you want to structure that? Secondly, I wanted to ask you how you're thinking about the organization evolving. So it started out with localism and green concepts. I presume it's structured as a for-profit. Mm-hmm. So as a for-profit, as you bring in more larger institutional investors, let's say, mm-hmm. do you see any of the double bottom line initiatives being at risk, and how would you think about managing those things?
That's a great question. I'm actually not very good at fundraising, and so the challenge is on me as a founder. In Silicon Valley, Sheryl Sandberg writes about it. They talk about imposter syndrome, and so I really struggle with that. And so, Ben Horowitz at Andreessen Horowitz is our lead investor, and really has a focus on finding ways to relate to entrepreneurs from different backgrounds. But whatever background you're from, sometimes when you take in the Silicon Valley capital, you kind of wake up and say, oh my God, the odds that this would happen, and we'd be a venture-backed corporation are really low. I'd better find a way to kind of live up to the standard of an Airbnb or an Uber, and that's a lot of pressure. So I would not say that the money is coming to us, although that's starting to change a little bit. And as we raise our next round, we do expect it to be much easier than our last round. We're doing to your latter question, we are doing a deal with the chairman of Google and his mission-aligned fund that is focused on climate change. And the thesis for his investment is around financial return, but also around looking for scalable models that can address climate change. One of the things that they asked for was a sidecar letter that indicated, in the event of a Series B or a Series C or a Series D, as larger VCs come in and take board seats, what are the ways that they can help us to maintain a focus on carbon emissions, which fundamentally, again, to go back to the idea of you're looking at a building, you could install a solar hot water system, you could install a natural gas system, right? The natural gas system is more profitable. It's more profitable for the customer, it's more profitable for us, but what might be more profitable for the planet is the solar hot water system. How do we continue to be incentivized as a corporation to focus on installing that solar hot water system when it's a little bit more difficult and a little bit more expensive? So what we've structured as a sidecar letter that commits our corporation on top of our core operating agreements. As we accept some seed capital from them, we're signing a sidecar letter that indicates and kind of explicitly outlines that we intend to follow through on a set of commitments as per their investment, or we have to pay their capital back. Now, if things work out, we might be in a position where it is more profitable to repay them their seed investment plus whatever return they've made to date, and then kind of go off and install a bunch of natural gas systems. But those are the kinds of mechanisms that we are trying to employ.
We'll take one or two more questions. One in the back. Oh, Alan. Alan, sorry.
So we're interested in that, and as you guys know, Professor Kogut is one of the leading researchers on that. Wrote a really great paper that's been really important to us. We have not used that concept yet, but we expect to in Q1 of 2017, and we're working on it right now. One of the deals we're working on, for example, is in Philadelphia. You have the head of the city council, comes from a low-income neighborhood in Philly, graduated from what is widely considered to be the most violent high school in America. And it's a great site for solar, but it turns out that the administrator there has been burned by other solar projects that haven't quite panned out. So the question is, how do you use a social impact bond to provide capital from the private sector or angel investors or folks focused on climate to install the solar panels on that high school, hire some of these kids so that they learn how to install solar panels, and then as the solar panels perform, the school takes over the future operation and payments of the solar panel system. So we're interested in structuring projects like that where you have kind of local government entities that are not able to take on risk, but you have private sector capital that's willing to take on that risk, provided that the government agrees to buy them out if the project performs. And so we are looking to launch a few of those in Philadelphia as well as in the Bronx.
Roy, do you have a question?
Thanks, Richard. Donnel, first, congratulations on having started this movement with greening of housing, which I think is terrific. But the question I would have is, aren't large corporations who are looking for a way to get with it in climate change adopting this in a major way? And aren't some of these coming after you to come into a mega corporation to make this happen nationally?
Yeah, that's very insightful. Lots of corporations are greening their assets that they own, buildings that they own, and that's great to see. We have a data science project with IBM where we've built a machine learning application that builds a predictive thermodynamic model of every building in New York City. And so we built a map, and you can click on your building, and it says, look, here's what we think, based on a bunch of data that we have, it would take to green your building. Here's what we think it would cost. Here's the rate of capital. So we're going to launch that. And IBM has been working with us on that on the back end. And they've assigned someone to evaluate and do some diligence in terms of an acquisition. So that's kind of the first time we've started to explore conversations around potentially, like, what does it look like to really partner with a larger company that has global reach and a huge balance sheet And is that a better way to achieve the kind of large-scale outcomes that we want to see? I think part of the challenge, we've been doing some research on this, and lots of founders who get bought by large companies don't end up having the kind of impact inside the larger organizations that was the hypothesis of the acquisition. And so I think Forbes or Fortune has spent a lot of time doing research on recent acquisitions. In particular, they highlighted, I think Ford bought an artificial intelligence kind of automated driving company. And one of the questions is this team of hotshot, Silicon Valley founders going to be able to navigate inside Ford in order to really push the kind of self-driving capabilities inside Ford as a global organization? And do early stage founders, and even founders who are much smarter and more disciplined and savvy than I, can they successfully navigate the kind of corporate politics inside a large institution like that? And so these are the kinds of questions that we're trying to answer. What we have seen is that there isn't an interest on the part of Wall Street firms, who again are trying to, some of them have some PR issues. Some of them have high net worth clients who are looking for these kinds of investment opportunities, and we have seen a lot of interest from them in terms of partnering with us for large scale projects that are useful to their brand. Does that help? Okay.
So, Donnel, thank you. Sorry?
Mm-hmm. And there's kind of a top-down, there's a level of authority that comes with that.
Which requires a very enlightened CEO. Thank you very much, Donnel. That was a wonderful presentation.
Great.
Congratulations on everything that you've done. Thank you, Bruce.